Hi, everyone. My name is Mark. Today, we're going to be talking about ICS vulnerability report, insight, trends, and prediction for OT cybersecurity in 2025. Before we start with the content, just a quick introduction. So, like I said, my name is Mark. I'm ICS security manager for Verve, a Rockwell automation company. I've been doing cybersecurity consulting for 7 years. 6 of those years I've been on ICS OT cybersecurity. I've led multiple ICS advisory research. You have my email here if you have any questions following the webinar, or if you have any other questions. Who am I? Like I said, I've been doing cybersecurity consulting for 7 years. During those years, I've worked in different industry vertical, including manufacturing, energy, oil and gas, healthcare, aviation, and many others. As a CS security manager, I also lead, on top of leading ICS advisory research, I also lead tech-based enable assessment and cybersecurity strategies. So let's get into it. First and foremost, I'm going to go through a quick summary of some of the results we've got from our research. So 2023 marked another year of significant growth in the number of OT-specific cybersecurity events across the globe. In our research, we found more than 350 new advisories published each year for the last 3 years. With those trends, we can estimate that in 2025, we'll probably see at least 2,000 new identified vulnerabilities, CVEs in CISA, and probably more than 400 ICS advisories. A lot of them have higher critical severity, and there's obviously an ease of exploitation for many of those vulnerabilities. So that's something to keep in mind. What we've observed as well is that the critical manufacturing and energy sectors are pretty much the most impacted sectors. Doesn't mean the other sectors are not impacted, but those are the two that have the most ICS advisory that target them, basically. As part of the actions that are needed from what we've seen through our research, there needs to be prioritized vulnerability management, improved asset management, and defense in depth strategy. So through this webinar, what we'll do is that I'll walk you through some of the results that we've had over the last couple of years doing that ICS advisory research that we've been doing. And then we'll talk about how to build on that, look at the trends, and basically build on that to build a proper OT-ICS cybersecurity strategy. So before we present the result, just a little bit of the approach that we take in order to do that ICS advisory research. So every year for the last couple of years, what we do is that we collected all the ICS advisory results and CVEs. We analyzed those results and reviewed any discrepancies or gaps in the 2023 period. So we looked at the nature of the disclosure based on the available data. We look at the cause noted in certain of those advisories and the different CVEs they contain. We look at the consistency. From there, we compare the results with previous years to understand those trends within the OT market, and we couple that with a bit of our trend hunting. We review the results, aggregate them together into multiple dashboards for kind of a final analysis. And from there, we analyze each ICS cert advisory for severity, exploit vectors, linked to product names and software version. We look at what the relevant risk intel and is for each of those advisories. And from there, we kind of cross-reference all that data with those tendencies to capture change in the ICS market and basically find trends that define security needs in 2025. So that's kind of our approach. What is an ICS advisory? Kind of an important part. ICS advisory are what I call the data sheets that provide some kind of advisory on industrial control system specific vulnerabilities. So what they include is vulnerability information, so CVEs, vendors, products, version affected, includes a reporter, whether it's a researcher or a company, and includes some potential mitigation strategy. So what you can see on the left is an example of one that we looked at for 2023. As you can see, there's a quick executive summary. There's also a risk evaluation. We looked at affected product, and we do a deep dive into those CVEs as well. So some of the key findings of 2023 that kind of define what we need in the future when it comes to cybersecurity. I'll talk a little bit about some of the actions that are kind of needed faced with some of those observations. So I'll try to point out a few implications as well with those findings. So let's go through it. So if we look at just the sheer number of ICS advisories over the last couple of years, what we can see is that the number continued to grow in 2023. So it's been growing every year for the last couple of years. As you can see, between 2022 and 2023, the difference of advisory is really minimal. We're talking about just one. That's the number of CVEs, so the number of common vulnerabilities are in it that just skyrocket. So we went from at about 1,000 in 2021 to 1,700 in 2023, which is kind of a big growth. Multiple causes for that. It's possible that organizations are kind of posting, being a bit more transparent about vulnerabilities that they find, but it's also possible that there's more and more people and threat actors that are basically posting vulnerabilities, and those end up on basically CISA's database. If we look at the average CVSS in 2023, so CVSS is kind of the scoring system of severity for each of those advisory. What you'll see is it's about 7.96, so about an 8. It's a high severity, which means that a good majority of those advisories that are on CISA's website, when we look at those ICS advisories, are pretty much high severity. So it just shows that there's a lot of high vulnerabilities and critical vulnerabilities that companies need to look at when they want to do their vulnerability management. So what are the implications for DOT security? So ICS advisories, CVs keep growing, like I said. That means that organization needs to be prepared to protect themselves in the future. All the old advisories are still there. All the old CVs, all the old vulnerabilities are still there. And when we look at all the new ones that get published by CISA, it's kind of only the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot of stuff, 0 days and other vulnerabilities that might not be on CISA's website. So that means there's a lot more out there than what we see from CISA, but CISA is already a pretty good indicator of a good amount of them that are out there. What we saw as well is almost half of the reported vulnerabilities, we're talking about 49%, over the last year could affect more than one sector. So even if there's some sectors that are kind of more impacted by those advisory, none of the OT, ICS traditional sectors are safe from all those different vulnerabilities that are out there and that get found each year. What that means is that building an effective OT security program demands that organizations really understand the risk, the vulnerabilities, and the threats that they face. By looking at those findings, it's a lot easier for organization to basically take actionable decision today that will ensure a more secure tomorrow. And this is what we want to do as an organization, take decisions today that really will reduce the risk and allow us to be more secure in 2025 or in the future. So by looking a bit deeper into those ICS advisories, this is kind of what we found when it comes to vendor analysis and asset management. So what we saw is that there's over 100 vendors that were affected by ICS advisory reported by CISA for all those that were published in 2023. The top affected vendors are mostly Siemens, Rockwell, Mitsubishi Electric, pretty much big vendors that provide a lot of the embedded devices that end up on an OT network for a lot of different other organizations and different industries. Something to not forget is that a lot of the vendors are not actually reporting ICS vulnerabilities or sharing the vulnerabilities with affected customers. So that's a list that we get with the CISA advisory. But like I said before, there's many others. It's important to take in consideration that there's a lot of end-of-life products impacted by those ICS vulnerabilities. So many of those don't necessarily have patches. And there's many advisory that impact third-party software, and that basically could impact vendors that are not listed in the advisory itself. So when you're doing your vulnerability management, you need to make sure that you look at those third-party software and make sure that if there is a bit of software like that on one of the devices, even if it's not listed in the advisory, the specific device, it might still be vulnerable. So it will demand a bit more research, a bit more actions on organization's part. So a couple of action items based on that vendor analysis. Make sure you have a comprehensive asset management, right? It's important to know that which asset you have, whether you're using Siemens, Rockwell, a combination of both, or a lot more different OEMs and vendors. It's important to have that comprehensive asset management, really understand what you have in your network. Step data on vendor-specific advisories and patches. Like I said, not every vendor posts advisories on CISA, but some of those vendors actually have advisories and alerts and updates on their own websites. So by monitoring those websites, by really going and looking at those, it's easy to have, well, it's not necessarily easy, but it helps to have a better understanding of all the different vulnerabilities that you may have on your assets. And the last thing is to kind of consider vendor diversity. Of course, vendor diversity means a bit more maintenance, but realistically, if there was to be a really critical vulnerability on one of your devices, if you have that across all your plants and that's the only kind of device that you're using, then all your devices will be impacted. So if you have a bit of vendor diversity, at least you might be in a better shape if one of those devices was to go down. Like I said before, Siemens is kind of continuing to be the OEM that report the most ICS advisories. So if we look at the total number of advisories that were reported in 2023, Siemens reported 113. So about 30% of all the advisories that were published during that year. Multiple reasons for that, right? Siemens has been really transparent, been publishing a lot of advisory themselves. So it helps, and they make sure that people know when there's something happening with one of their product. But when we look at all those advisories, the reality is that 31% of the advisory affected multiple products, and we have 87% that affected multiple versions. So based on that, it's really important to have, again, a comprehensive asset management, step data on vendor-specific advisories. Make sure you look at the different products and versions that are affected, and that you don't just look at the new year, you look at previous year as well, because even if there's new vulnerabilities, that does not mean that the old ones are still not a threat. So all sorts of different things to look at when it comes to vendors and version affected and products. Like we said before in the summary, critical manufacturing is still the industry that's the most targeted. So what we saw in 2023 was that 42% of the advisories impacted critical manufacturing sectors. There's also 132 multiple sectors. So CISA basically said that multiple sectors may be impacted without necessarily specifying which ones. So that probably includes a lot more critical manufacturing as well as part of that. There's multiple reasons for that. Critical manufacturing, as defined by CISA, the sector processes all the raw material and produces highly specialized part and equipment that are essential for the primary operations of several other industries. So when we look at all those critical manufacturing advisories, there may be some that impact energy sectors, right? If there's parts that are made by critical manufacturing, and it may impact as well water and wastewater management, and all sorts of different other industries that are not necessarily listed in that specific advisory. So based on that, it's not too much of a surprise that nation states, cyber terrorists, and other threat actors of that kind are attacking critical manufacturing sectors. What that means for all the organizations that are part of that sector or that have a link to that sector is that you should really adopt extra vigilance, have a bit of increased monitoring, do some threat hunting of your own, make sure that you really follow on all those different advisories that get published for sectors that are linked to critical manufacturing without being critical manufacturing. If there's any chance that they may be one of those advisory, one of those vulnerabilities that affect you, it's not a bad thing to go and search for those. You can use the search tool in CISA. You might be able to find a good portion of them, but it's important to do that research and really being vigilant, basically, in the end. Through our research, what we did as well is look at the vulnerabilities. So if we look at each advisory, there are 371 that we had. They all contain one or more vulnerabilities, so one or more CVEs. Here you can see on the right, there's 200 unique vulnerabilities issue values that were found for a total of almost 2,000 vulnerabilities. All right, the 201 pretty much describe what you can see on the left. So, for example, improper input validation is one of the 201 unit vulnerabilities. After that, those vulnerabilities exist in more than one CVEs, more than one advisory. With that number that keeps increasing, right? What it means is that robust vulnerability management program is important. You need to make sure that you look at those vulnerabilities. You need to prioritize mitigation based on criticality and accepted risk level. So it's impossible to just mitigate all those vulnerabilities in a few hours, in a few days, in a few months. It's important to really have some prioritization out there. Look at the criticality of your assets, the criticality of the vulnerabilities, and look at what's your accepted risk for each of those assets or subnets or anything along those lines. And the last bit is, remember that vulnerability does not mean exploitability. So what we mean by that is that you may have on your network, let's say 50 critical vulnerabilities that you can see through your asset management. But it's highly possible that only 5 or 6 of those critical vulnerabilities are actually exploitable when you look at your overall network. So that's kind of something that you need to keep in mind when you do your prioritization, when you decide what you're going to patch, what mitigation activities you're going to be doing, is that if a vulnerability is critical but cannot easily be exploited, it's probably not where you should put your first couple hours. Your priority, basically, number one, should probably be all those exploitable ones. There's a lot of vulnerabilities. All right, we talked about exploitability. What we saw through the research is actually that a lot of those vulnerabilities are actually could be pretty easy to exploit. So CISA gives the list of vulnerabilities that have known exploit. So as you can see, there's 35 CVEs in 2023 that have known exploit in their catalog. What that means with known exploit is that they've been exploited in the past. So it's been recorded that in the wild, out there, someone, a threat actor, has exploited one of those vulnerabilities before. So what we can see is that if we look at other data pieces, there's also 243 advisories. So 65% of all the advisory that were saying that they were both, they had vulnerabilities that were both exploitable remotely from an adjacent network and with low attacks complexity. We're actually talking about 90% of all the advisories that have a low attack complexity. So that's something to keep in mind. The implication of that is that there is an urgency in addressing easily exploitable vulnerabilities. Like I said, there is definitely a need for robust network segmentation and access control, and there's an importance of monitoring for exploitation attempts. So monitoring for exploitation attempts, if someone tries to exploit one of those known exploited vulnerabilities, you want to make sure you catch that before you're even able to mitigate that vulnerability. You want to make sure you have that monitoring piece in place. Having network segmentation and access control is basically a way to try to make sure you have extra security measures. So if someone was to get into the trying to get into the network, it's not as easy to get to that asset that may have that critical vulnerability that has a known exploit. So you really want to put extra layers of security out there with some network segmentation, right? Make sure you create that OT zone or those OT zones depending on your network, and having access control, which include remote access. A lot of the time, some of those vulnerabilities get exploited because a third party, an OEM, or even an employee remotely access the network. There's not too many controls. They don't actually have to go through a remote access solution. A lot of that stuff happen on TeamViewer, for example, and one of those vulnerabilities get exploited. So it's important to have that as well as part of your controls. That at least if you're looking at your cybersecurity strategy, that should be at the top of that. So what can you do based on all those trends, everything that's happening on the network? How do you use the information available to prepare for the future? So first of all, not all the CVEs that get posted, that get put on CISA's website or on the internet actually impact you. So it's important to find out which advisories, which CVEs, which vulnerabilities basically impact you. One of the ways to do that, one of the best ways to do that, is to actually have comprehensive asset management. What that will do is that you'll be able to identify what your assets are on your network. You'll be able to look at all those different components, such as the versions, the OS version, the firmware that you may have on it. And from there, you're actually able to find out which CVEs, which advisory actually impact you. So basically, through good asset management, you're able to identify which assets are vulnerable. You're able to determine if the assets are truly critical, right? Which asset, well, the best question to ask is what happens to those assets if they go down? If the answer is it doesn't impact the operational process, it's probably not a critical assets. It might be a high severity assets. It might be still important for the company, but it's probably not a critical asset, because your process can still run, your lights are staying on, you're still delivering your product, you're still making it. So those assets are a part of that process are the critical ones. So having that asset management in place really allows you to look at those critical assets, identify them, and after that, really look at which advisory CVEs impact you. And after that, you can prioritize based on that. So prioritizing vulnerability management, a couple of pointers. You can focus on high CVSS scores, right? Everything that's a CVSS score of 8 and plus, for example, is I or critical. Critical is usually 9 or 10. So you can use that as kind of a metric in order to prioritize your vulnerability management. What you can do as well is prioritize vulnerabilities based on known exploits. So look at the one that have known exploited vulnerabilities. And CISA's ICS advisories. You can look at the KEV catalog, so the known exploited vulnerability catalog that CISA has as well. You should consider the asset criticality in your prioritization as well. So like I said, not all your assets have the same level of criticality. So it's important that you identify which one are actually critical to your process in order to prioritize securing those first, mitigating some of those vulnerabilities if possible. The last part, having a structure, continuous vulnerability management process is important. You want to make sure that you have that structure in place, that when you're looking at all the vulnerabilities that you have on your network, on your assets, that you're able to actually have a structured way to identify which one you want to put first when it comes to mitigation, which one do you want to delay, which one are not important that you want to accept the risk caused by those. It's just important to have that structure there. So a way to do it, if you want to prioritize based on asset risk score, is you can look at the asset types. What the asset is it a PLC? Is it a computer? Is it a server? So you can look at the asset type that you have on your network. You can look at the criticality components, right? Is there dependencies network-wise? Is there some OT applications on it? So you can basically look at the criticality of those assets like we talked about just before. Then you want to look at the risk component. Is it end of life? Is it poorly patched? are you lacking configurations on it? And from there, you can pretty much get a raw unmitigated score of each of your assets. So it really allows you to prioritize based on the assets by just taking a few couple of data points, putting them together, and that gives you that kind of raw unmitigated score on each of the assets. From there, if you want to prioritize based on assets, you have to look at what's already in there when it comes to controls. So controls, mitigation components such as is there whitelisting on those assets? You already have backups of those assets. And from there, that will change your kind of unmitigated score, and you should be able to get that estimated residual risk score per assets. And that allows you, for example, to really prioritize based on each assets where you want to put that mitigation. So after that, like always, you can accept some of the risks. You can probably transfer some of that risk, but by having that estimated residual risk score, you're really able to determine based on your targeted risk level which asset you want to prioritize first when it comes to mitigation. So when you're ready to go for that mitigation part, one of the first things that you're going to want to look at is that patch management plan as part of your OT roadmap for the future, right? So you've identified all your assets, you've identified all the vulnerabilities that kind of affect them. Next thing you want to do is you want to see which patches exist. So which asset exists and could be deployed, because it's not like it's not because you have, let's say, 50 patches available that you can actually deploy it in your OT environment. A lot of those patches can't actually be deployed without affecting compatibility. A lot of them, if you're running 24/7, you're going to have to decide which one you're putting in place when you have that maintenance window that you have either yearly, every 6 months, monthly, depending on the organization. So it's important to look at what can be deployed. You want to test those patches, right? You don't want to go out and just deploy patches randomly, because if you deploy something and you can't roll back and it affects your process, then it's just against the point of patching, right? You pretty much cause yourself more trouble than anything else, and that's really not what you want to do. You want to make sure that there's not going to be any disruption to the industrial process. That should be priority number one. And after that, you want to make sure that it's not going to impact the compatibility between the device you just patched and the rest of the process. So after that, depending on the nature of your organization, a lot of the OT, ICS, traditional organization are running 24/7, right? You need to make sure you patch during a maintenance window, because you want to make sure you don't impact the process. You want to make sure you don't impact your operations. And once you're ready with that, and you kind of prioritize which patches you want to put first, or which assets based on whether you're using asset risk or anything like that, then you can go ahead and during that maintenance window deploy those patches. So basically, in the end, in a lot of cases, right, organizations think that patching is not something that's possible, but it's always feasible. Well, at least it's feasible in many cases, but it really needs to be managed carefully. You can't just go out there and patch it the same way you would patch an IT environment. You really have to be careful on what you're patching, how you're patching it, and when. If you can't patch, there's often alternative remediation control. So one example of that is configuration management. So certain vulnerabilities can already be mitigated through just putting a configuration in place. So if there's something like that you can do that's not going to be affecting the process, then that can be a good option to remediate some of those vulnerabilities. You have to be careful before changing a config on certain assets, right? You need to make sure that, again, that's not going to impact your operational process. But if you can do it, it's not going to impact anything, then it can be a really good option. Again, if you can do those configuration changes or that configuration management during a maintenance window, it's probably the best. but many times assets have been misconfigured or still have the default configuration. So if you're able to put a couple of configurations that will have cybersecurity, that's always a good thing. The next part that's possible to do for remediation is device replacement. Of course, in OT, quite often there's a lot of legacy systems or end-of-life systems. They're there for many reasons, right? Sometimes it's just because you need those devices to work for your process. You can't change them. Realistically, if you change them, if you wanted to change that legacy system that you have or that end-of-life device, you have to change the entire system, all the devices around it, which can be costly and difficult to do, requires time. So in a lot of cases, it's not possible. But if you're able to replace a device to a less vulnerable one or one with more support, it's generally a good way to reduce risk. So, but again, you always need to keep in mind that compatibility, making sure that your process keeps running and nothing goes down. Last piece of it is compensating controls, right? So if remediation of that vulnerability is not necessarily possible, there's always other ways to kind of remediate some of those vulnerabilities, reduce the risk, right? Mitigating some of that risk, and it's through compensating controls. So any control that is not necessarily going to eliminate that vulnerability, but at least going to reduce the risk caused by that specific vulnerability without basically removing it. So one compensating control, for example, that you could have on a workstation is closing the ports that are on it. If you don't need to use any USB key or anything like that as part of your process, closing all the ports, ensure that if there is a vulnerability on that workstation that could be exploited, that at least people can't just come and plug in using an external hard drive and go ahead and exploit it. So it's compensating control, right? The vulnerability is still down on the workstation, but at least there's a bit less risk of someone exploiting it, for example, because you have closed those ports. Other compensating controls that are good to put in place is network segregation and segmentation, right? Making sure that it's more difficult for threat actors to do privilege escalation or lateral movement inside your network. Especially if you have kind of a flat network where it's easy to go from IT to OT. It's always good to have a little bit of network segmentation there. So you try to isolate subset of the network. Ideally, you create those zones based on security requirements. So, for example, some OT zones where you put all your some of your assets, so your OT asset, into security zones where you'll put controls around it. All right. That will reduce the risk for a lot of the critical assets, right? Taking all those OT assets, putting them in their zones. If there needs to be a communication, you can always have a conduits. So basically a communication path for that subnets to communicate with other zones, but it's always good to have those kind of isolated, segmented from the rest of the network through logical segmentation or physical segmentation. All of those different elements kind of come in the end to implementing defense in depth, right? So what defense in depth is applying multiple countermeasure in a layered ups or stepwise manner. So realistically, you can put a lot of those different controls. You can put network segmentation in place. You can put some patches. You can change all your configuration. But realistically, you're pretty much only as secure as your weakest link. So if you only take care of those three different elements, then a threat actor might still go around them using remote access control, or they could still go through physical means, right? They could get in the plan, just walk in, basically. So it's important to have all those to look when you look at your cybersecurity strategy, to really have that layered and multiple countermeasures in that. So what it includes is physical security, policies and procedures. You want to make sure you look at your zones and conduits, right? That network segmentation. You want to make sure you look at malware prevention. So having that antivirus IDS, IPS. You want to look at access control. You want to make sure that people who are accessing the network are the right people, that people are not just accessing the network easily. You want to make sure you have that monitoring and detection, where we're talking about activities or people logging in, remotely accessing the network. You need to have that monitoring piece there as well. And after that, the portion that we've talked about just before, all that patching. So, like I said, it's important to have multiple controls in a layered way. Perimeter defense is not enough. And ideally, if you're able to actually have a regular security assessment to make sure that you have stuff in place for each of those elements, each of those buckets, and it's best. And you can, after that, deploy security controls and compensating controls in there. When we talk about detection, all that monitoring and detection, we're including alarms, logs, or any other detection method to identify unusual data transfer patterns, protocols being used, communication to unknown or unexpected MAC IP address. So that's really important. And one of the things that's not actually listed on the left, but still important, is to have an accountable and timely incident response. Because if all those controls fail and the threat actor is still able to get in the network to start actually impacting your network, impacting your process, then you need to make sure you have that incident response process that's in place so you can react quickly and efficiently to an incident. So when we look at that defense in depth, one of the things that we talked about was that access management. So one of the elements that needs to be part of a cybersecurity strategy, especially for as you're looking to the future, is that strengthening remote access security. So it's important to have different elements like multi-factor authentication and things like that when it comes to access in the network. Realistically, it's not always possible because in a lot of OT environment, there's shared accounts that are used. But still, you want to make sure that as much as possible, you have those controls like MFA, that you use VPNs with latest security patches. And after that you monitor and log all those different remote access attempts. So if you're able to also have kind of timestamps and everything for your remote access attempts, you can also look at patterns like, let's say you have an OEM that access every day from between 8 to 5. If there's a remote access attempt at midnight or 3, you want to make sure you monitor for something like that. You flag it, and that you can quickly start your incident response process if needs be. So if you're able to have that kind of monitoring, it's best. Otherwise, just at least having monitoring logging of people that are actually remotely accessing the network. You want to make sure that people are not just accessing using TimeViewer and doing some modification, or they can easily access the network and do some modification and you never know about it. That's not something you want to have. So as part of that, as your process evolve, as you get new vendors, as your employees come and go, as you hire new people, you need to always regularly review and update that remote access policy. Make sure it's up to date. Make sure that the people that need access can access. The people that don't need that remote access are not able to. Another element of the defense in depth, and it often get forgotten, is having resource allocation for OT security. So a lot of the time when a company is starting their cybersecurity journey when it comes to OT, they don't actually have dedicated OT security resources, people that really understand both sides of the coins. So there's often people that understand the supply chain, all the operational process, and people that understand cybersecurity. But you need to make sure that you bridge the gap and that you have dedicated OT security team members that can actually look at that and understand and really push for putting in place those control, for making sure that you don't impact any other process, that you're not just doing the same thing you're doing for IT, basically in an OT context. You need to make sure that you have those people. After that, if you if you really want to have higher OT security, you need to invest in OT specific security tools. There's a lot of tools out there that are historically specialized in the IT that can kind of touch the surface of an OT network, right? The network devices that are used into it, or some of the workstation. But realistically, you want to make sure that you also invest in OT specific security tools that will go all the way to your PLCs, all the way to your HMIs, all of those OT devices that often get left out by those traditional IT tools. Next thing you want to do is have regular training and skill development for your different resources. That's not just for your OT security team. You need to also have those trainings and skill development for people that are on the floor in the plant, for people that are touching the process from afar, right? All those cybersecurity people or supply chain people that are in offices need to have that training, skill development, and OT security. And in the end, you want a balanced approach to basically people, process, and technology. Because if you put all your money into technology, all your time into, all your efforts into technology, but you don't have enough training and awareness for your people or the right processes, then you're still at a higher risk of getting an incident in your OT network and your operational process. One of the last piece as well is that it's important to stay informed and agile. We talked about all the CISA research and the libraries and stuff that we looked at to kind of gather those trends, but a lot of those that information is not necessarily fully accurate. There are some limitations. So if you're purely using CISA's libraries to kind of look at your vulnerabilities, sometimes there can be some typos, inaccurate information, right? There's some advisories that are for the wrong vendors or CVs they contain, they're targeting other OEMs, for example. They can be, when we talk about typos, sometimes company names, country names, and more. So if you're only doing like research into the ICS advisory, you might miss a few just because there is a little inaccurate information in there. Sometimes there's also a little bit of missing information. So if you only look at those advisories and you take everything that's in it, and there could still be some missing vendor CPs in there, some missing vulnerable assets and versions, and realistically as well, it is possible that some of the known exploited vulnerabilities that are in the advisory and the KV database are not comprehensive enough. There could be other known exploited vulnerabilities that just haven't been published on the website yet. So what do you do based on that? Like I said, use multiple information sources beyond CISA. CISA is a good source. There's a lot of information on there. We like to go and really look at that information because there's a lot of good content there, a lot of good vulnerability information, but it's not enough. You need to really go beyond that. Regularly review and analyze vulnerability trends. You want to make sure that you do that. Participate in information sharing communities. So there's all sorts of different sources and forum and social media where you can get information on all those different vulnerabilities and new vulnerabilities that may not end up on those other sources, and add up your security strategy based on emerging threats. Your security strategy that you're building based on everything we just talked about needs to live. It cannot stay static. You need to make sure that as there's new vulnerabilities, new risks that pops up, you adapt it. You make sure that the controls you're prioritizing are the one that are actually going to reduce your risk as much as possible. And so basically you need to make sure you adapt that security strategy. When we talk about the different sources of data you can use for that vulnerability management, of course, there's the ICS advisory that we talked about, but there's also those third-party OEM advisory that exist, all sorts of CDs, CPs that are out there that are posted directly by some vendors on their website. So if you have certain vendors, monitor their website to see if they have that. You can also do some vulnerability scanning using an OT tool. right? Make sure that you don't impact your process. Same thing for penetration testing. If you're able to really do small penetration testing, really targeted to certain elements, that can be a good source of data. You want to make sure, again, that you're not just doing random penetration testing. You don't want to crash your network. You really want to make sure that everything stays up and running. So that's always the main concern, keeping the lights on. Don't impact your operational process. But if you're able to do it in some small subnets or something, then it can be an actual good source of data. There's more sources, of course, but that's just a couple of different things that you can use in order to make sure you have that vulnerability management program that's going to feed after that into your risk management. That's going to feed and deciding which compensating controls or patches you want to put in place. So another way to kind of look at your strategy, how to build it, is to do what we call a tech-enabled assessment. So what you do is you basically do an assessment of your vulnerabilities, of your risk using the technology. So what that entails is usually a walk down of the sites, making sure that you understand the process, everything that's going on it, the critical assets. From there, you discover all the assets that you have on your network. You make sure you have a good view of everything on it. And then after that, you're able to identify all the gaps in your assets on your network, the known vulnerabilities, missing patches, insecure configurations, insecure assets users. A bunch of guest accounts usually end up still being active. For example, you're able to look at your network connectivity, backups. Do you have AV? Are they the latest signature? All sorts of different things that you're able to identify vulnerabilities and risk for your network by doing that assessment. And that will really, after that, feed directly into your remediation design or your cybersecurity strategy, where you'll be able to have that sequence of initiatives that you want to take, a tactical action plans. How do you ensure your cybersecurity goes to the next level? How are you getting ready for that 2025 that we talked about? And you're able to also look at required enablers such as infrastructures, upgrade, hardware, everything that basically you need in order to improve that cybersecurity. So what it means to build a robust OT security program or an OT system management is that you want to make sure that you customize what you're doing for OT. What we mean by that is too often OT is kind of misunderstood. Its intricate nature is kind of forgotten. We try to do what we're doing in IT for OT or just use the same policy, but most of the time it's not necessarily the best approach. Having an OT system management or OTSM, really a robust program for OT cybersecurity, means customizing policies, processes, tools, make sure that the team responsible for OT understand the sensitivity of the environment. And really it goes down to 4 pillars, right? Making sure that you have those policies and procedures that match the specific OT environment and your organization and your process and everything that goes with it. Developing that talent and workforce, make sure you have the right people for the job, people that understand the process, that understand cybersecurity, they understand what they need to do. Identifying the relevant tools and automation, see where you can put tools that will help you to secure your organization, your operations, that will allow you to really understand what's going on in your process. And last piece that is really important when you're building that program is to understand that OT system management requires a significant change effort. You cannot go into trying to get better cybersecurity without expecting a lot of changes to happen. You need to be open to that. You need to make sure that it's part of the process as well. You need a good change management process, and you need to be open about all sorts of different changes that are going to happen in your network, in your environment, your policies, your ways that you're doing certain things. And yes, that's it. So in conclusion, if we recap on everything we just kind of looked through, as the numbers advisories keep growing, your vulnerability and risk management program should pretty much follow suit. You need to make sure you have vulnerability management, that you really prioritize how you're managing those vulnerabilities. You need to improve your asset management. It's important that you look at what you have in your network, that you make sure that you prioritize based on the criticality of those assets, of those subnets. You need to make sure you have that remote access security, that people can't just go around all the security measures that you're putting in place. You need to have that defense in depth. Right? You really need to put layered security measures, not just invest in one of the different elements that's part of a cybersecurity strategy. And after that, you need to make sure you stay informed and agile, make sure you monitor what's going on, look through all the different things that get published, new incidents, new vulnerabilities, all of those different things like that. Also, if you look at the intricate nature of OT security, organization need to ensure as well that in the future they have continuous improvement of that cybersecurity. That strategy lives with them. It doesn't just stay the same as it was when it was first created. It needs to stay alert, and that they look at the OT systems requirement and the potential limitation. Like I said, you can't patch the same way, for example, that you're doing in IT and OT. You need to make sure that you would look at all the system requirement, whether we're talking about bandwidth, whether we're talking about connections, compatibility. And after that, you need to make sure that you, with all the technology stuff that you're doing, all the efforts that you're making there, you don't forget about people and process as well. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening. I have a couple of questions that I received in advance. So for the Q&A section, I'm kind of going to go to some of those slides. If you have any questions, please reach me on my email, right? If there's anything that we didn't answer today, or that I'm not going to answer through the Q&A section, if there's anything I missed, please reach out to me. Happy to connect and just exchange on that. So if I go through some of the questions that we received, and if we have a bit more time at the end, I can always take some of the questions that people may have right now. But if I go through some of those questions first, because I want to make sure we cover them. Question one that we received is, are there any standards or best practice used for risk rating of OT ICS vulnerabilities? Before we talk about the risk rating by assets, what you can also do as well is, if you look at organization like ISC 62443, there's other approach to kind of risk rating, right? As you can see in there, they pretty much look at each zones. They look at the threats that they have for each of those zones, the threat scenario. From there, they go through the consequences, and they're able to get to basically a risk scoring. A little bit of the same way that we did it with our asset approach. They look at the countermeasures that are already in place. That gives them kind of that mitigated risk score. And after that, as you can see, what CISA recommend as well is to look at different recommendation and have your targeted risk rating that you're aiming at. So that's kind of one of the ways to do it. There are other organizations out there like NIST that are offering other ways to kind of do risk rating, but IC 6243 ISA already has a really comprehensive way of doing it, so I suggest looking it out. Question two that we got, how can we prepare against the threats that are to come? How do we understand how to protect our systems operation if these threats are yet to be created? First thing first, take care of the basics, right? Make sure you have those policies and procedures, awareness and trainings. You have access management, that you have, that you look at your assets as well. You have that asset management. You look at the vulnerabilities that are available out there. Really understand what needs the most protection, so you can prioritize and really focus on that as a priority. So look at the critical assets. Do your network segmentation, make sure that those critical assets are segmented somehow using firewalls or any other ways. So make sure you have that in place. Backups, of course, make sure that if something happens, you have those backups. It will save you a ton of time, a ton of headaches, and after that defense in depth. Question 3 that we got is, how can organization effectively prioritize and mitigate ICS vulnerabilities to prevent potential cyber attacks? Again, there's no perfect solution, but organization need to make decisions based on multiple criteria. We talk about criticality of sites, assets, vulnerabilities, risk, exploitability. Not every vulnerability is exploitable. Risk reduction, what will reduce the attack surface the most. If you can put a control, it will reduce dramatically the attack surface, and it doesn't take much time, then that's probably a good place to start. Any quick wins that you can have as well, something that doesn't take you much time to put in place, and that will actually reduce your risk, always a good thing to look at. Limitation to keep in mind, budget, right? None of us have unlimited budget, unfortunately. Resources, you need to make sure you have resource availability to put in place all those mitigation controls. You want to make sure you have the expertise, right? Who's going to manage that control, who's going to deploy it, etc. Question 4, I have another one after that one that I want to cover as well. So there's a total of 5 questions that we got before. But so question 4, what role does awareness play in defending against ICS vulnerabilities? What best practices should be adopted to ensure organizations are prepared? So like I said before, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Even if you have all those technologies in place, if you don't have controls for people and processes, you're still pretty vulnerable to an attack. So role-based specific training, awareness campaigns are really important, from the operators, the asset owners, to the corporate employees that work on supply chain security and all that stuff. Third-party management, you want to make sure that they are aware of your process. What I mean by that is that they don't do any modifications or they don't do anything that could impact your process. You want to make sure you have that access management, access control with role-based access control and access level. All right, so you want to make sure that if you have, for example, an operator and he's allowed to change a configuration, is there a threshold to how much he can change that configuration? There's been a couple of events in the past where people change the configuration to a level that's pretty much that can be dangerous, basically for people's safety. You want to make sure that you don't have that, so you have access level on how, even if you can modify, how much can you actually modify that configuration, for example. And after that, you need to customize those OT policies and procedures. Make sure you sensitize your workforce, and that's pretty much it. Last but not least, on those questions that we received before, how can organization leverage threat intelligence and monitoring tools to proactively identify and address emerging vulnerabilities? While threat intelligence monitoring should be part of the sources of information you're using for your vulnerability management program, like I said, it's important to use multiple sources of data, because any source of data that you're using will have a certain level of limitation or gaps. And you should also have other controls in place to make sure that if a vulnerability is found, a new one is found, there's still a level of security in place. That's pretty much it for the question that we got here. I know we're pretty much at time. So if there's anything that I didn't answer, please send me an email, and make sure to watch our next webinar. We have an upcoming NIST 2 and OT security webinar where on October 3rd, we have some Rockwell automation expert that will be talking about NIST 2 compliance. So with the October 2024 deadline for NIST compliance that's coming, right? Those Rockwell automation expert will talk about understanding NIST 2. Make sure you understand the actionable strategies for it, overcoming the different challenges that comes with it, and will give you insight on how to deal with NIST 2 and a good compliance roadmap. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.